This video is part 4 of the series on Sihang Warehouse. If you haven't watched the previous parts, I highly recommend you watch those videos first. I have included the links in the description. Around 3 a.m. on the 29th, Major Yang Ruifu went to inspect the troops who were working on the fortifications in the warehouse. He noted in his memoirs that while some troops continued working hard, others had fallen asleep due to exhaustion, as they had already gone for 3 days without rest. Major Yang warned the soldiers against doing so and reminded them of the importance of finishing the fortifications in the warehouse. At 6 a.m., a group of soldiers performed a flag-raising ceremony and raised the flag that had been delivered by the Girl Scouts the previous evening. There were in fact 2 flags that were raised above the warehouse. On the previous day, the Girl Scout Yang Huimin had initially delivered a smaller flag to the defenders. This was before she returned with her fellow scout members on the evening of the 28th and presenting the defenders with the larger flag. Looking at historical photographs taken that day, it is evident that the larger flag was raised above the western warehouse while the smaller one was raised above the eastern building. However, overshadowed by the larger flag, the story behind the small flag had mostly been forgotten. As a result, there is a lot of contradictory information regarding the smaller flag, and many questions remain, including whether Yang Huimin was really the one who delivered it, when exactly was it delivered on the 28th, and when was it raised above the warehouse. Due to this, I would like to point out the information I provided in the previous video, which suggested that the smaller flag was raised on the 28th, may not be accurate. Unless more information emerges about the smaller flag, the true events surrounding this flag may remain a mystery. The raising of the flags above the warehouse greatly boosted the morale of both soldiers in the warehouse and civilians in the international settlement, with both soldiers and civilians alike cheering and celebrating. However, this seems to have agitated the Japanese, and around 7 a.m., their machine guns, stationed on the roofs of buildings west of the warehouse, opened fire. Japanese planes once again circled the warehouse, but for the same reasons as the previous day, were unable to attack. These planes made a total of 4 or 5 attempts to get closer to the warehouse, but each time they were driven back by Chinese machine gun fire. Around noon, 4 to 5 armored vehicles were spotted along North Suzhou Creek Road and north of the warehouse along Guoqing Road. It was feared that these vehicles were getting ready to support an infantry attack on the warehouse, and as a result, Chinese machine gunners in the warehouse started firing at the vehicles. The Japanese fired back, and this time, they also managed to get their mountain guns in position west of the warehouse and began pounding the warehouse with 75mm shells in addition to machine gun fire. In the meantime, Japanese infantry also gathered for an attack on the warehouse. Major Yang later estimated that there were hundreds of Japanese soldiers around them. All of this was visible to those watching the action in the international settlement, and using the phone connections, people from the international settlement repeatedly called the defenders in the warehouse to pass along information. One of the more crucial pieces of information was the fact that the Japanese assault was to commence at 2 p.m. that afternoon. The British also warned the 1st Battalion of the impending assault and tried to persuade them to leave the warehouse. However, the defenders refused, as their orders were to defend the warehouse, and at 2 p.m., the Japanese began their assault. Supported by machine guns and artillery, Japanese troops attempted to take the warehouse. After an hour of heavy fighting and taking many casualties, the Japanese once again decided to call off the attack. As Sihang Warehouse was next to Suzhou Creek, the Japanese Navy then decided to try an attack from the water. At 3:30 p.m., a pair of Japanese motorboats filled with Marines left the Japanese fleet on the Huangpu River and advanced westward up Suzhou Creek. Although the Western powers controlled the land in the international settlement, they couldn't control the vessels that passed through the waterways. As such, the Japanese tried to approach the warehouse from the east, which is from the direction of the international settlement. However, soon after the boats passed under Laojia Bridge, also known as Fujian Road Bridge, they became stuck in the river traffic. Now's a good point to deviate a bit from the battle and talk about the naming of the bridges. I had initially decided not to go in depth on this out of fear of causing unnecessary confusion, but after receiving multiple comments about this in a previous video, I will try my best to explain the unofficial names of these bridges here. The most important bridge to the events around Sihang Warehouse is the Tibet Road Bridge, or in Chinese, Xizang Luqiao. A concrete bridge located just east of the warehouse, it was unofficially known as the Xin Laji Qiao by the locals. When translated to English, this means the new garbage bridge. Some people have replaced the term laji with 垃圾, which means the same thing, essentially garbage or trash. At this point, some of you may be thinking that if there is a new garbage bridge, there must be an old garbage bridge, and in fact, there is. The original old garbage bridge, or 老垃圾桥 in Chinese, is the Zhejiang Road Bridge, also known as the Zhejiang Luqiao. This steel truss bridge was the next bridge downstream from Tibet Road Bridge and predates the concrete Tibet Road Bridge that we see during the fighting in 1937. The names that were given by the locals in fact had nothing to do with the quality of the bridges. To understand the origins of the names, we must go back to the 1800s. Due to the rapid growth of Shanghai in the late 1800s, a major problem presented itself. It became harder and harder for those in the city to dispose of the ever-increasing amounts of waste. Thus, in the 1880s, a special garbage collection agency was created. The location of this agency was at or around 933 South Suzhou Creek Road. A garbage collection pier was also set up here. At this location, the trash from the city could be gathered and loaded onto boats in the creek, which would transport them out of Shanghai through the rivers. However, the inconvenience of having a major garbage collecting pier in the middle of the bustling international settlement soon necessitated the need for it to be moved elsewhere, after only a few years. The original garbage pier was replaced with a jail that housed exclusively foreigners. This jail faced south towards Xiamen Road, also known as the Amoy Road in English, and as a result was known as the Xiamen Road Jail, or the Amoy Road Jail, which is marked on this map. An interesting point to note is that on this map, the Old British spelling of the word jail is used. The Zhejiang Road Bridge was first built around 1885 and was made of wood. It was built just east of the garbage pier, and as a result of its proximity to the site, the Zhejiang Road Bridge became known to the locals as the Garbage Bridge, or 垃圾桥. Around 1899, another wooden bridge was built close to the current location of Tibet Road, although this bridge in actuality predated the road and went by a different name. This newer bridge was located west of the garbage collection pier and as a result was known as the New Garbage Bridge, or Xin Laji Qiao. The wooden Zhejiang Road Bridge was replaced in 1906 with a steel truss bridge, which is the one that is seen in 1937. The Tibet Road Bridge was replaced with a concrete one around 1922, and by now served as a crossing point over the Suzhou Creek for the newly built Tibet Road. Although the site of the garbage collection pier was now the Amoy Road Jail, locals at that time still commonly referred to the area as the garbage pier. As a result, the two newer bridges maintain their unofficial names of Old and New Garbage Bridge. The last bridge we are going to talk about in this series is the Fujian Road Bridge, also known as 老闸桥. The Japanese Navy motorboats got stuck in the Suzhou Creek soon after passing under this bridge. When translated to English, 老闸桥 means Old Sluice Bridge. The origins of this name dates much further back than the previously mentioned garbage bridges. Throughout history, sluice gates have been built on Suzhou Creek in order to control the influence of the tide on the creek, with the earliest ones dating as far back as the Song Dynasty between the years 960 and 1279. At this time, Suzhou Creek was still known as the Song River or Wusong River. Over the course of history, the sluice was repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt. Around 1672, during the reign of the Kangxi Emperor, the sluice was once again rebuilt and again destroyed soon after by the powerful tides from the Huangpu River. Eventually, a new sluice was built in the early 1700s during the reign of the Yongzheng Emperor. This new sluice was built further upstream, away from the old sluice gate. In 1864, a bridge was constructed at the location of the old sluice gate. It was built in the form of a drawbridge in order to allow for the passage of river traffic. Since it was built at the location of the old sluice, it became known to the locals as the Old Sluice Bridge, or Lao Zha Tiao. After being damaged, the old drawbridge was replaced in 1885 by a higher wooden bridge. The height meant that most vessels traveling along Suzhou Creek could pass under it, so there was no longer a need for a drawbridge. This will be the same bridge that is present in the international settlement during the Battle of Shanghai in 1937. I don't want to get too carried away talking about ancient Chinese history, as this series is about the Battle of Sihang Warehouse. However, if you enjoy learning about this type of history, I would recommend a channel called Bygone China. The channel has some really nice videos on Chinese history and culture, and is definitely worth a visit if you enjoy learning about these topics. I have included the link in the description. For now, let's go back to 1937, back to the Battle of Sihang Warehouse. Authorities in the international settlement were already growing increasingly concerned about the possibility that stray shells or bullets from the fighting would cause casualties within the international settlement. The British and Americans had already begun to pressure the nationalist government to withdraw the troops from Sihang Warehouse. The news of Japanese naval vessels in Suzhou Creek only served to heighten their fears. If the Japanese vessels managed to continue up Suzhou Creek, there was a real chance that they would eventually engage the Chinese troops in the warehouse. If the Chinese fired back, not only would they be shooting into a Suzhou Creek that was heavy with river traffic, they would also be firing towards the international settlement, towards the spectators that had gathered to watch the fighting, and worst of all, towards the natural gas storage tanks just across the river. Although Chiang had intended to use the 1st Battalion to demonstrate to the Western powers China's determination in the fight against the Japanese, the 1st Battalion was starting to be a major headache for those in the Western nations, and later that day, they would formally request the Chinese government to pull back the troops from the warehouse. British soldiers under General Alexander Telfer Smollett, the commander of British troops in Shanghai, were quickly sent to seal off the area around Laojia Bridge to civilian traffic in an attempt to minimize civilian casualties if fighting did break out. Authorities in the international settlement then began negotiations, trying to persuade the Japanese boats to leave the area. At the same time, civilians in the international settlement kept the officers of the 1st Battalion informed of the situation developing around Laojia Bridge. They even managed to send them a map of the area and pointed out the location of the bridge. Morale among the Chinese troops at this time was high, especially since they had just managed to successfully repel another Japanese assault. Major Young noted that some soldiers even managed to find their own form of entertainment. They created decoys by tying helmets to bamboo poles, which they would stick out of windows or openings in the wall. Whenever a Japanese machine gunner fell for the decoy and opened fire at the helmet, laughter would erupt among the defenders. After a lengthy negotiation that spanned from the afternoon into the evening, the Japanese finally agreed to pull their boats back, and disaster was narrowly avoided. Around 6 p.m., the firing had died down. However, soon after, under the cover of darkness, the Japanese attempted to use an excavator to dig a trench or tunnel towards the warehouse. At the same time, the defenders also spotted more armored vehicles, which were getting ready to storm their positions. Lieutenant Colonel Xie as well as Major Young quickly devised a plan on how to repel a nighttime Japanese attack. Firstly, if the Japanese troops began advancing towards their positions, a flare would be launched in their direction, and machine gunners would fire at those who had been illuminated. Next, if the enemy managed to get close to the walls, flashlights would be tied to bamboo poles and extended out the windows. Others will then throw grenades towards the Japanese troops that had been caught in the light. Lastly, cotton found within the warehouse was to be soaked in kerosene, lit on fire, and thrown outside the warehouse to create a barrier. Japanese fire continued intermittently throughout the night. As midnight approached, the soldiers once again had to endure another sleepless night.